Hello, good morning. Welcome to the Sunday Show. I'm Martin Geissler. I'm going to be with you right up till 11 o'clock this morning. Here's what's coming up. We're going to have the latest in our series of election interviews to help you decide who's worthy of your vote. 3 parties pitching to you this morning. First up, the Scottish Greens. Flying high in politics here, of course, over recent years. They got themselves into government, then brought down a First Minister. But can they mobilise support in a Westminster election? Their co-leader Patrick Harvie will join me in the studio. Then, former First Minister Salmond will be with me. He, of course, now leads the pro-independence Alba party. He said this week he wouldn't be running for a place in the Commons. He'll be here to explain how a vote for them could, he says, advance the cause of independence. Plus, Reform UK had a big start to the week. Nigel Farage is back, milkshake and all. He gets a lot of attention, that's for sure. But can he finally translate that into electoral success? The polls suggest Reform have the Tories sweating. Helen McDade is carrying their message in Scotland this morning. They're standing in every single seat here. I'll speak to her too. And after that, at 11, it is over to Fiona on the radio and on BBC Sounds. Hi, Fiona.
Morning. 4 hostages kidnapped by Hamas have been reunited with their families after being rescued in a raid that Palestinian officials say killed scores of people. We'll hear what's happening on the ground. We'll do some election number crunching with our resident pollster Ailsa Henderson. And Scotland has been bouncing to the sound of Taylor Swift and Girls Aloud. We'll catch up with fans who've been to both gigs. More at 11.
All right, Fiona, thanks very much indeed. We'll hear from you then. Right, let's get on with the programme. Yes, another campaign week over, another week closer to polling day. Manifestos are going through the spell checkers right now, being ready to be revealed in the next week or so. You, I'm sure, will already have some thoughts on the campaign so far. If you do, please share them with us online. The hashtag on social media is, as ever, BBC Sunday Show. So, was this the week where the campaign really ignited, really started to deliver? It feels like a while ago now, but we had the first head-to-head TV debate, remember? Between a nervous Sir Keir Starmer and a hectoring Rishi Sunak. Did he lie about Labour's tax plans? Labour certainly claim he did. Then there was the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings. The tributes, the dignity, the emotion, the huge electoral blunder from Rishi Sunak. David Cameron lining up with world leaders. So, where was the Prime Minister? He left to do a TV interview, bringing fury down upon himself, even his own cabinet colleagues calling him out. And here in Scotland, a hastily arranged press conference. The Tory leader Douglas Ross announcing he would stand in this election after all, taking the place of the former Scotland Office Minister David Duckett. He's been ill recently, but he said he was looking forward to running for Parliament again. "Oh, no, you don't," said his party, who deselected him in favour of their leader. Not a great look, many seem to feel. Well, let's get some thoughts on the week that was with this morning's panel. We're going to have a panel, of course, every week of this election campaign here on the Sunday Show, bringing us the benefits of their experience and their expertise. With us this week, we have Chris Stark, the former head of the Climate Change Committee, the watchdog, which has wrapped the knuckles of both Holyrood and Westminster recently. He's now with the Carbon Trust, helping businesses reach net zero. Talat Yaqub, a regular, of course, on the paper review with Fiona on a Sunday morning, is a writer and campaigner focused on equality. And Dougal Sharp founded the Scottish brewing giant Innis & Gunn. He was an outspoken critic of the Scottish Government's now defunct deposit return scheme. Good morning to all of you. Thanks all for being with us. Talat, let me come to you first. People have been complaining it's been a boring campaign up until now. It kind of ignited this week. What did you make of what you've seen?
Well, it ignited into flames for the Conservatives, certainly. This has been a particularly bad week for them. From Rishi Sunak's position in the TV debate, where he has been now called out by senior civil servants for essentially what Labour are saying is a lie. His D-Day, leaving early from D-Day commemorations to come back for a press interview, to which even his most loyal voters will find particularly difficult. Now, the Conservatives can't afford to lose much trust and faith with voters, but their strongest base is in those who would have wanted to see him there and commemorating and paying tribute. His own, in the papers today, his own senior team, included David Cameron, are furious. And then, of course, it's Douglas Ross taking the position from a candidate and former MP who is recovering from a spinal injury in hospital, who says that he was told whilst in hospital that he can no longer run. This is not a good look for Conservatives, who are approaching decimation in the polls as it is. is. And I can only conclude that either somebody senior in Rishi Sunak's team doesn't want him to win, or perhaps he doesn't want to win himself.
Well, we shall see. 4 long weeks to go. This has all happened in 1 week. Plenty will happen between now and the polls, that's for sure. Chris Stark, we in the media tend to kind of obsess over optics, imagery, that kind of thing. Are we focusing on the right things here? Can you understand why there is such public interest in the events that we've described and not much attention in this campaign by anybody, really, to climate issues?
Well, I can understand it, but I think the underlying issues are still there, that we have a challenge to decarbonise a whole economy. There are a global set of issues in play here. And as you say, Martin, we've heard almost nothing about that in the campaign. What focus there has been at all on climate issues has mainly been on that old issue of oil and gas licenses, which frankly is a very, very minor issue in comparison to some of the bigger challenges here about how we move ourselves around, how we heat our homes, the jobs and industries that we have beyond oil and gas. So it's another one of these election campaigns where sadly we're not really dealing with the big issues. But let me say, of course I understand why we focus on these things. I mean, the Prime Minister's had a terrible week this week. And of course, that makes the headlines. And I think one of the challenges in my area in climate is that you've got to turn it into news. And it doesn't always work that way. So, I'm one of those voters that's been looking at the events this week with as much interest as you. So, I understand all of that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. Your professional passion and the passion in most of your life, but also got to decide how to cast your vote like the rest of us. Dougal Sharp, are you hearing what you want to hear so far in this campaign? What should they be talking about?
Well, I mean, I think this week particularly, like other weeks in the run-up to this, it's been very hard to engage. And I know there's been lots of playground sort of stuff going on in the background and a lot of stuff in the media about who's been where and things like that. But I'm really looking for information on what's actually the key policies and the manifestos and how we're going to change the situation we're in, because at the moment it doesn't feel like we're in a great place as a country. I personally feel quite disengaged with all the parties. I just don't feel like they're speaking to me or for me.
Well, they're not going to be speaking for you this morning, but they are going to be speaking to you. We're going to get the manifestos in the next week or so, but we have 3 leaders on this morning to give us their pitch. Panel, stay with us. We're going to come back to you more than once between now and 11 o'clock. Thanks very much indeed for that for now, though. As with every election campaign, the polls do help us to tell the story. The researcher and pollster Mark Diffley is here every week on the Sunday show to talk us through some of the themes that are emerging in this campaign. Morning, Mark.
Martin, hi.
So we're just about to come to the Scottish Greens and to Alba, to Alex Salmond. Let me talk to you about independence, both of those parties in favour of independence. We hear a lot about this kind of missing 15% or whatever, 50%-ish of the population broadly in favour of independence, 35%-ish say in the polls they'll vote SNP. Where is that 15% that's missing? Are they going to the Greens and to Alba?
Well, the short answer to that is that most of them are actually going, for this election at least, to Labour. So if you look at the 4 polls that have been published in Scotland since the general election was called, then somewhere between 20 and 25% of people who say that they are going to be, if there were a referendum, they would support independence, they would vote yes. About a quarter of those are going to vote Labour. The big question is whether they're lending their vote to Labour or whether this is a bigger shift that we're seeing. Of course, some of them will be going to the Greens and will be going to Alba, but the majority, as we said, are going to Labour.
Yeah, we'll have Anas Sarwar from Labour on here next week. We can ask him about how deep that or how shallow that love is at the moment. But this week we're going to be talking to, as I say, Patrick Harvie and Alex Salmond. Let me ask you about the Greens then. Has a period in government changed things for the Greens, do you think? People now know a lot more, perhaps, than they did before about what they stand for and how they work. Has that helped them in the polls?
I mean, it has, actually, if anything. What one would normally observe from a small party who has been in a coalition or an agreement with a bigger party is that it's usually the small party that comes out of it worse, right? Think of the Lib Dems after 5 years of coalition with the Conservatives, got an absolute kicking at the 2015 election. What seems to be happening in this case is the opposite. The Greens are polling. They got 8% of the regional vote in 2021. They're now polling up at around 9 or 10%. So they're doing, in other words, at least as well as they did as they did at the Holyrood election 3 years ago. So they seem to be kind of bucking that trend of the small party suffering. And clearly, the profile that the party's had in the last few years has, one way or another, increased their profile. And for voters, they are much clearer now about what the Greens are for or against.
All right, and just in a sentence or two, if you can, Mark, just so we can frame the Alba interview that's coming up in a minute, where are they in the polls in relation to our other guest this morning, the Greens and Reform?
Well, the Alba will have a very marginal effect on the general election. There's only standing 19 candidates, so only in about a third of constituencies. So that obviously limits their, just numerically limits their impact. They poll at around 1 or 2% in the national polls. They do much better, again, at the regional vote for the Holyrood election, where they're polling up at around 3 or 4%. So they will be a bit of a disruptor. They will take some votes from the SNP, and which could make a difference, could help Labour, of course. But I think overall their impact will be marginal.
All right, Mark Diffley, much more from you coming up later in the programme. Thank you for now. Okay. So we're going to have party leaders in the programme every Sunday in this new extended section of the Sunday show. Remember, with you through till 11 o'clock. We're going to make sure you know who's promising what by the time polling day finally comes. The first of our interviews this morning is with the co-leader of the Scottish Greens, Patrick Harvie. Morning. Thanks.
Good morning.
What are you hoping to get out of this election?
Obviously, every political party wants to get votes, wants to get a deeper connection with the voters, with the electorate. And if we can make a breakthrough and win a first seat in Scotland, that would be amazing. We have to acknowledge the first-past-the-post system is a deeply unfair electoral system. It does leave many people feeling a little bit bullied into voting for whatever they think are one of the two front runners in their own constituency. We like to remind people that actually the only wasted vote is a vote for something you don't really believe in. And I think at the moment, with most other political parties being actually quite dishonest about the state of the country's finances, all of them running away from any kind of talk about raising tax, even from the very wealthiest, and Labour, who look set to form a thumping great majority government, sticking to Tory fiscal rules, and that means more years of cuts and austerity. I think it's really important that there's a voice on the political landscape that's saying, actually, we could be a fairer and more equal society if we raise tax on the super rich, on the wealthiest, and on excessive profits, and reinvest in the public services that have been starved so much.
Right, that's your big offer then this time around, is it? Raise a tax on the super rich?
It's a critical part of it, and it's deeply connected to that transition to net zero that you were just talking about with Chris Stark, because that also
raise from it?
Requires huge investment. Well, the wealth tax that we've proposed, which is only on multimillionaires, right? It's not going to be a tax that applies to everybody else. The low end of the estimate is that it could raise 70 billion a year. That's information that's come from the University of Greenwich. It's not our own figures, so it's been independently produced. Upper end of the estimate, up to 120. But even if it was at the lower end of that estimate, that's a huge opportunity to reinvest in rebuilding public services and in the transition to net zero.
To what extent have you factored in tax avoidance in all of that? Because what we do know from the super rich is that they're very smart, probably much smarter than politicians when it comes to stopping people getting their hands on their money. Have you just taken the amount of wealth and divided it by the percentage tax increase, or have you factored in people saying, oh no, you don't, I'm moving it?
Well, as I say, the work on this has been done by independent academic experts, not by our own party. So it's figures that have been produced by...
proposing it as
it's figures that have been produced by people who are experts in tax and fiscal policy.
Right.
But there is a long-standing problem with successive UK governments not doing enough to tackle tax avoidance. In fact, Rishi Sunak has even been accused of using, being the beneficiary of a tax haven fund in the past himself. That legitimate legal tax avoidance should be outlawed. It should be seen as deeply antisocial behaviour.
OK, let me go back to the stuff we were talking about with Chris Stark and the stuff you were touching on a minute ago as well. Your kind of central policy, the environmental policies that are at the heart of everything that you say you do. It seems at the moment the taps are staying on in the North Sea, and most of your rival political parties are broadly happy with that. None of them radically coming out and saying, shut it down. Is that not a clear indication that's where the votes are? And if that is where the votes are, you've not done your job in getting the message across, have you?
Well, I think that over the last few years we've seen really quite an interesting change in Scottish politics, with most political parties moving toward a position that Greens have advocated for a long, long time, which is to say the policy of maximum extraction of oil and gas has to end. And that move began to happen. And over the last, well, in some ways just recent months, but the last year or so, I think it has started to shift back in a much more regressive and short-termist direction. The reality is, if you work in the oil and gas industry, if your community is economically dependent on the oil and gas industry, what you need is a transition. What you need is the investment to move away as fast as possible before that industry comes to its end.
Really? Because, as fast as possible?
Because what Chris Stark was saying about the difference between new licensing not mattering very much, what he means there is that the UK's production is in rapid decline. And whether you apply these new licenses or not, it's a question of whether it declines a little bit faster or a little bit slower.
Do you just ignore the warnings that 100,000 jobs rest on this?
Well, there are about 30,000 jobs directly in the oil and gas
industry. Well, according to Aberdeen Grampian Chamber of Commerce, 110,000.
And a lot of what they're talking about there is induced jobs, wider economic impact in the economy. That would be there with the transition industries that we need to grow. That's what we need to focus on, is the opportunity that Scotland has. Scotland is blessed with incredible renewable energy resources. That's not just for producing energy for our own needs. It can produce a green hydrogen industry that will allow us to have an export product.
But the whole thing about a transition is a process. I mean, you don't transition from 0 to 100 in 8 seconds safely, do you?
You also don't do it by doing what the oil and gas industries themselves are doing and increasing their oil and gas production. Investing in the industry of the past that is not our future, that's a dead end. We need to be ensuring that we invest for the future in the industries that can genuinely last and that can create jobs that will be there for the next generation. I've spoken to people in the oil and gas industry who are deeply concerned about their immediate circumstances, but they'll turn to me then and say, I know this job's not going to be here for my kids. Their generation won't be working in oil and gas. And what they need is the opportunity to have some hope for the future. And that is only going to come from transition, not from doubling down on the oil and gas industry in the midst of a climate emergency.
OK, well, one of your last acts in government was scrapping our climate targets, or at least endorsing the government's scrapping of the climate targets. Why did your green targets fail?
The climate targets that were originally set were certainly achievable if you had seen the acceleration in action on reducing emissions from transport, from how we heat our buildings.
You were in government.
Industry
Transport
and land use.
was part of your brief.
I was in government for about 2 and a bit years, and we brought forward the most ambitious programme on decarbonising our buildings, the biggest ever investment in active travel, actually the biggest investment Scotland's ever seen on climate and nature.
You endorsed these targets originally, you were in government, and they failed.
Yeah, absolutely. And if there had been that 15 years of radical, accelerated action to get on track with those targets, they were certainly achievable. The acknowledgement that the government has now made is that because of that inaction, because of that slow pace of emissions reduction, apart from electricity generation, that's the one good success story we've had so far, because of that slow pace of emissions reduction, the 2030 interim target is now out of reach. And
surely that's a dent in your credibility.
It's a dent in the long-term record of the Scottish Government, absolutely. They've been missing climate targets for years before we joined the government.
You were a part of it, so it's a dent in your credibility.
We joined the government with the intention to accelerate climate action, and what we've seen since then is actually some of the SNP's own backbenchers attacking pretty much every part of an environmentally responsible agenda, whether that was the deposit return scheme, which was ultimately blocked by the Tory government in London as well, whether that's measures on reducing car kilometres.
We're about to hear from a guest, I'm sure. The deposit return scheme was blocked by business who thought it was a dog's breakfast.
Or indeed whether we're talking about the Heat and Buildings programme. An absolutely critical part of it. There's no path to net zero without that programme of decarbonising the way we heat our homes and buildings and making it affordable for people. OK, let me move on then. let me look at independence. You're very much a pro-independence party, or so you say. So many constituencies in this country are ultra-marginal. Virtually every constituency south of Stirling, I heard recently, is effectively a marginal constituency now. A couple of thousand votes for the Green Party could hand those constituencies to Labour, to the Tories, to pro-union parties. In ultra-marginals, you're still urging people to vote Green, are you? I'm urging people to vote Green wherever they have the opportunity. We've got more candidates than ever before. I think more than double the candidates that we had in 2019.
Even if that would push their constituency into unionist hands?
I'm really absolutely firm in my view that an election is an opportunity for the voters to choose, and they have to be given the widest range of choices available to them. You know, this is, I'm certainly an independent supporter. I think I probably always will be.
Is it a red line for you? Lorna Slater told me in this programme, independence is not a red line for the Scottish Greens.
How many times is that going to be quoted out of context? I
asked the question, she gave me the answer from that seat.
Yeah, she said it. She was being
Is it a red line?
She was being asked about if there was a future Labour government, would we refuse to cooperate them on issues because of independence? And of course, if there was a future Labour government, if they're going to implement something like rent controls in the private rented sector, we would work with them to achieve that.
But here you are saying no tactical voting. You're quite happy to see seats fall into Labour or Tory hands. I am happy to see every Green vote in every ballot box that we can achieve if we persuade voters to vote like our future depends on it, because it really, really does. The next UK government, we know it's going to be a Labour government. We know it's going to have a really substantial majority unless something utterly dramatic happens in the opinion polls in the next couple of weeks. The real danger is that we'll see a change of government, but not a change of politics. A change of direction is needed in the country, and that's not going to be achieved by a Labour government that's committed to Tory fiscal rules. So they need to be under pressure from a more progressive direction, not just from a bunch of, whatever rump of the Tory party is left in Parliament and the far right under Nigel Farage. Talking of progressive politics, I did an interview on the radio this week with an organisation called Fossil Free Books, who are at the vanguard of getting rid of Baillie Gifford as the sponsors of all of Scotland's major book festivals, essentially. Are the environmental protesters who are effectively shutting down all of Scotland's major book festivals doing the right thing?
Well, look, I have mixed feelings on this in some ways in the way that I do with some of the Extinction Rebellion protests, for example, which impact on people rather than on the targets like the big fossil fuel companies. The critical thing here is, what is your target? What are you trying to achieve? Now, if the target, if the objective of that campaign was to get Baillie Gifford to divest from fossil fuels and from companies that are tarred with association by Israel,
they found it difficult legally to do.
If that was the objective, it hasn't worked. The objective should not have been to defund literary festivals, and I don't think that's what Fossil Free Books wanted to see as an objective.
It's what happened. Were they misguided?
Well, look, the opportunity that we have to take, and I think where politicians come in, is to say, how should we fund cultural events like that if we don't want them to be dependent on the whims of big investment companies and the associations with toxic investments like that? And we've just put forward a proposal, for example, a very modest £1 levy on the mega gigs, like the Taylor Swift concerts that we've just seen in Edinburgh. And that could raise money to invest in cultural and creative work, whether that's things like festivals, whether that's grassroots.
We're straying a little bit from the question. Was that campaign misguided?
I think I don't think the goal was to shut down literary festivals, and that's a real. The goal should be to focus on the investors and the investment decisions that they make, and that's a very legitimate goal.
Should they take Baillie Gifford back as a sponsor?
The danger here,
the festivals back on their feet.
The danger here is a campaign that ends up hitting a soft target when it should have been aiming for a hard target, like the investors.
Would you like to see them take Baillie Gifford back if it got Wigton, Edinburgh, all these book festivals?
I would like to see every investment company say, we've got a very clear ethical criteria. We will divest 100% from fossil fuels.
I know you would.
And from
but would you like Baillie Gifford to come back if it got the book festivals up?
Those are the kind of sponsors
about depriving people of the opportunity.
Those are the kind of sponsors that I would like to see our cultural sector be able to work with. But as well as that, government has a responsibility to say, we can raise the revenue on the big, super profitable parts of the cultural sector to invest in the stuff that does require that level of financial support. So government has a responsibility here to come up with solutions, and we've done that.
Patrick Harvie, thank you very much indeed for your time here on the Sunday Show this morning. Now, BBC Scotland's holding the only general election debate in Scotland which lets you put your questions to the Scottish leaders of the 5 larger parties. Here's Stephen Jordan.
This week, debate night will be on Tuesday evening on BBC One Scotland with a Scotland Leaders special live from Glasgow. If you want to come along and ask the leaders of the Scottish parties questions, then fill in the details on our website, bbc.co.uk/debate night, and join us. Debate night Tuesday live at 8 on BBC One Scotland.
Yeah, don't miss that. Debate night special with Stephen Jardine. As he said, Tuesday, 8 p.m, BBC One Scotland and on the iPlayer, of course. Now, another party hoping to hoover up any independence votes are Alba, formed in 2021. They have yet to have a representative elected under their banner. Will this election be the one? Their leader, Salmond, is with me here in the studio. Good morning.
Good morning.
You're not going to be elected because you're not standing. Why?
Because I'm set my sights on the Scottish Parliament in 2 years' time. And in terms of other folk getting elected, I think we've got excellent chances in a number of seats. I mean, let me on that debate next Tuesday, and that will increase Alba's chances.
Will it? OK, we'll see. I tell you who could be elected is Douglas Ross, and he could be your MP where you are in a very last-minute change of arrangements. Would you have stood against him if you'd known that was what was going to happen?
No, I'd set my sight on that seat in the Scottish Parliament. I actually announced it the previous day. That's Bamshire and Buchan Coast. Douglas Ross isn't going to be elected. I think I know the area pretty well.
He says he does too. He represented part of it for a long time.
A small part of it. But I mean, look, I think it doesn't really matter. But what matters is the fact that he has stabbed David Duckett in the back in the most reprehensible manner. I've never seen anything like it. And neither has the North East of Scotland. He's going to get his comeuppance. Absolutely going to get his comeuppance. I mean, there's another story about him in the papers today. I don't know if it's true or not. But what's going to do him down is the idea that you can betray one of your colleagues while they're lying critically ill in hospital. It's unbelievable.
The Conservatives say Douglas Ross had nothing to do with that deselection, I should say. He's not here to defend himself.
He could always have said as leader, no, David Duckett wants to stand, so let him stand. I mean, this is totally indefensible. You know it, I know it. But more to the point, the corner, the North East of Scotland knows it.
Yeah, look, we're talking with lots of people too much about other parties. Let's talk about you and your party. Are you still a credible force in Scottish politics, Alex? I mean, you're probably the best known of all the figures we'll interview in this studio on a Sunday morning, but are you still credible as a political force? Well,
we're 3 years old as a political party, you know, give us time. I mean, I'm trying to remember, it took the SNP, what, 15, 17 years to elect their first parliamentarian. We're going in a shorter timescale than that. Yes, we're credible. We've got some great candidates. We've got 6 parliamentarians, ex-parliamentarians, Westminster and Scottish, standing among our 19+1 candidates, the 20 candidates we're backing. So we're a credible force, and even as your pollster indicated, the last 2 polls in the Scottish Parliament, list vote, would give us seats in the next Scottish Parliament.
You're not doing as well as Reform in a lot of polls. I mean, they're a younger party than you, are they not?
Well, the Reform has the great benefit of appearing in all the television debates. But listen, our campaign is going to be in the ground. I'm not sure how Mark managed to estimate the Alba vote, because most polls don't list Alba. And even ones that do, like Redfield and Wilton, I'm not criticising them because at least they list us and show us gaining seats in the Scottish Parliament. They do it after others and don't know us. So let's just see what happens on the ground.
What's your estimate of the Alba vote? You must have the data.
Oh, I think we're going to do great. I think we're going to have substantial results in a number of seats. I think people should remember 2 things.
History suggests you're wrong in that.
Well, let's talk about history. Neil Harvie won his seat, County from Kirkcaldy, as an independent nationalist, didn't he? He won it having been disowned by the SNP. That's how he won it. And Kenny McCaskill's fighting the campaign that Scotland should be fighting to save Grangemouth Refinery. So these are just 2 of our candidates out of the 20, but we've got some excellent prospects, and you'll see Alba making its mark in this election.
All right, well, what's your offer then? If I'm a pro-independent supporter, why vote for you and not for the SNP?
Because we're the party which unambiguously believes in independence. You make your vote count for independence. This is the first election since 2003. Well, the SNP have been trying to avoid the constitutional issue, the independence issue. 2003 was the last time John was leader, incidentally, and it was a disastrous election. I mean, it's a simple, fundamental point. If the SNP wants to compete to win an election, they have to make sure that independence is the key issue of the election. They might do very, very well, as we've done in a number of elections, the SNP, or they might do just quite well. But unless you make independence and the Constitution the defining issue of the campaign, you shall lose. But that's what's happening to the SNP.
Under John Swinney, essentially what John Swinney is saying is we've tried a whole load of approaches towards independence. None of them have worked. Let's go for a slower approach. Let's make good governance show through. Yeah, well, he is saying that, isn't he? He's saying, without actually giving us these figures, he's saying, let's get approval, let's get support for independence up to whatever it is, late 50s, 60% consistently, to an extent to which you can go and present that to Westminster and they can't say no anymore. If they win this election, what would you do? What would your approach be? How do you achieve independence?
Let's take to it. Let's disagree with the premise of your question. I mean, you've just announced an SNP strategy. I haven't heard a single SNP candidate with a strategy for independence.
That seems to be his thinking.
Well, look, this is the first election, probably in the SNP's history, where they haven't had a strategy for trying to achieve Scottish independence. It's the first election for 20 years where it's not been the dominating issue. We believe that every election, every national election, in the absence of a referendum, which we're not going to get, every national election should be defined as a mandate for independence, and the independence parties, including Alba, should put on the ballot paper, this is a mandate, we're seeking a democratic mandate for independence. With that mandate, which means a majority of the popular vote, then you face down Westminster and you bend it to the will of the Scottish people.
But the SNP has won every national election for the last 14 years in Scotland and has claimed that as a mandate and has gone to Westminster and said, look what we've got, and Westminster has said, back in your box. What's different with you?
Well, there's two things that are different. One, you can't claim it afterwards. You have to say that up front. You have to say this is it. The SNP have just decided to take independence off the ballot paper, despite the fact they had a conference vote last October to put independence on the ballot paper.
But you putting it on the ballot paper doesn't mean you could deliver it.
Well, we're arguing that if there's a majority vote in an election for independence, then the Scottish Parliament should take that as a democratic mandate to initiate independence negotiations with Westminster. And how do you do that? Well, you use and mobilise domestic and international pressure to bend Westminster to the will of the Scottish people. That's what you have to do. And we've had many a press conference, we have set out what that pressure would be, Martin. We have an independence strategy. That's what makes us worth voting for.
Let me ask you what I asked Patrick Harvie about independence. Are you not putting the party before the cause? Your votes could be very disruptive, as Mark Diffley said, in a lot of very marginal constituencies. Your votes away from the SNP could be the ones that hand those constituencies to Labour in central Scotland, to the Tories perhaps in the North East. Does that play in your conscience?
No, not at all, because the SNP aren't campaigning on independence. They are avowedly not campaigning on independence.
But they're a pro-independence party, and it's your life's work.
And nor do I believe the Greens are a serious independence party. But the issue is this. Mark Diffley said he thought the independence vote, correctly you pointed to the 15-20% of independent supporters who are, according to current indications, not going to vote SNP. He thinks they're starting to vote Labour. I think some of them are, but the majority are going to stay at home. They're not going to vote. They're disillusioned, disenfranchised. Alba's appeal is to that disenfranchised 15-20%. We want people, instead of sitting at home, to get out and vote for Alba. Instead of voting for the Unionist Labour Party, to get out and vote for Alba. That's our appeal. But that's why, well, Martin, it's very important this, because our argument is we're mobilising a vote that's been disillusioned. We're going to mobilise the independence vote, not split it.
But you're trying. I'm going back to my previous point. You're kind of leading them back up the same hill they've been up many times before, and they're weary, are they not?
No, there's never been...
Independence, yes, but 10th in my list of priorities.
I can't remember the general elections in Scotland for some considerable time. It would be a novel thing for independence parties to say we're seeking a popular mandate at a national election, that that's what we should do. I haven't led, incidentally, any independent supporter up and down any hill. When I was leader of the SNP and First Minister, I delivered the independence referendum that I promised to do.
What happens if the SNP... What happens to the cause of independence if the SNP lose this election in Scotland?
I think there'll be a substantial and early transfer to Alba, and I think, of course...
What happens to the cause of independence if they lose it? Is it gone for years?
No. The health of the cause of independence is not the issue. Independence is supported by around 50% of the population. It's the health of the political parties who are meant to be advocating independence that's the issue. I mean, back in the day when I won the election in 2011, right, with an absolute majority in a proportional parliament, only 30% of people believed in independence. But we grew that because we campaigned for independence. So what will happen is that if the SNP suffers a reverse, and it looks like they're going to, hopefully with votes coming to Alba as an independence party, then the SNP will look to their laurels. They'll start to say, well, we cannot compete as some sort of quasi-devolutionist party, and they'll go back to their independence appeal. Incidentally, they know that full well. I was sent a letter this morning, a begging letter, a financial appeal letter from the SNP. A friend sent me it. It mentions independence in a single letter in 4 paragraphs 7 times. So when they're looking for money from independence supporters to talk about nothing else but independence, when they go on television debates, the word never crosses their lips.
Does it help you if they lose this election?
No, what helps us if Alba can start to register serious support at the ballot box. That's what's going to help Alba, that's going to help independence, That's what's going to help Scotland.
What's the best outcome for you in this election? Are you looking at winning seats?
Well,
if so, which ones? Where are your targets?
Well, the best outcome would be to win seats. I've already said Neil Hanvey's got an excellent chance in Cowdenbeath-Kirkcaldy. Our campaign in Grangemouth's a national campaign. The independent nationalists who are supporting the Hillian Year, Angus MacNeil, is a fine member of Parliament and agrees with us absolutely in the Constitution. But we've also got another, 17 excellent candidates coming forward, arguing the case for independence with mobilising campaign teams, which in turn will mobilise the voters.
Let me ask you quickly about stories on the front page of Scotland on Sunday today. University's chief calls for review of free tuition. Let me just sub the first paragraph. One of Scotland's most respected university leaders has called for a review of universal free tuition to find a compromise model that secures the future of our higher education institutions. Are the rocks melting in the sun, Alex Salmond?
No, not if I have anything to do with it. Paul Grice, who of course spent most of his career in the Scottish Parliament as an administrator, he should know a lot better. He knows what the feeling was in favour of free education in Scotland and how that redeemed a long-standing hope of the Scottish people. What is upsetting university finances just now is the UK government's refusal to allow the requisite number of overseas students to come, because the model in which Scottish universities...
Aren't we too reliant on that? I mean,
well, we're not too reliant.
Have you created a policy that has actually jeopardised the future of our further education system?
No, what's jeopardising the future is governments that won't invest in it. The point is now you need a balanced model of why shouldn't we have overseas students coming to our universities?
Well, what if China suddenly says, sorry, you're not going to British universities anymore?
No, it's the greatest thing, because there's plenty of people...
30-odd% of the students at Glasgow University are Chinese.
That's not the problem just now. The problem is not lack of applicants. The problem is the UK government won't let them in. It's as simple and as devastating as that. So I say two things. One, let's have control over these things so we can get talented young people coming to be educated in Scotland, to mix with our own people and getting a fantastic education. And let's invest in the universities so that every qualified Scot gets the opportunity of further higher or university education.
Last question. Stephen Flynn answered this in one word. I'd be grateful if you would too. You're off to the Euros next week. If Scotland aren't playing, will you be supporting England?
Oh, well, I'll support the best teams. I often do that.
Will you support England when they're playing, Mr. Salmond?
Probably not, because two things. One thing England never is in tournaments is an underdog. But sometimes they play like an underdog.
They're favourites.
Well, exactly, and I always tend to support underdogs. But listen, the question is academic. Because obviously Scotland are going, we will qualify and we will win.
Crikey. Big words from a man who's got a history of making big promises.
Are you going to lose?
Alex Salmond will hold you to that. Maybe we'll see you over there. Thank you very much indeed for that,
Pleasure.
Alex Salmond. Right, let's get back to our panel then to see what has struck them so far this morning. Dougal Sharp, head of Innis and Gunn. Let me see what you make of what you've heard. Anything struck you so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was great to hear from both party leaders there. I enjoyed listening, and I think listening to Alex there, whatever your stance on independence is right now, I think the priority for any party has got to be changing the status quo. I mean, I don't think we're in a great place in Scotland. I don't think we're in a great place in the UK, and I think particularly here, I think the people that I certainly know and speak to, our priorities are very clear. It's things like education, the economy, creating jobs, creating opportunity, enterprise, schools, hospitals. They are the things that I think most people are concerned about right now, and that we need to see a bit more momentum on in politics.
Are those people that you're speaking to engaged at the moment? Are they engaged in this campaign?
No. I wouldn't say so. I mean, I think I don't love the choices that we've got right now. I said that at the start. Nothing really is engaging me when my priorities are very clear. As an employer of hundreds of people, and a big contributor to the economy through VAT and HMRC excise duties and things like that. I don't feel that I'm being well represented by the parties. The big mainstream parties, the policies all kind of feel, certainly from what I've heard and seen, it all kind of feels more of the same. And where I am, I think we need some sort of somebody who's capable of taking a step back, a visionary leader that can actually change things. Because there's lots of talent and lots of opportunity in the UK. It just doesn't feel like we are doing enough to address these opportunities.
All we need is a visionary leader. 'Twas ever thus. Dougal Sharp, thanks. Just stay with us with the rest of the panel. Talit Yacoub, what's caught your attention this morning, if anything, from the interviews we've just heard from Patrick Harvie and Alex Salmond?
Well, I think it's really interesting. I felt like Alexander was managing expectations there when you pressed him on how many seats he thinks he will successfully get in this election. He talked about substantial results. He didn't place any names. He didn't talk about the kind of polling where he's doing particularly well, because the reality is that that's unlikely to happen. So there's some managing expectations there of results. What I think is interesting is also that he was unable to really talk about policy. He kept talking about independence, and of course that is the core purpose of Alba. That's what he wants to run the mandate on for any substantial results he gets. But I am interested in tackling rising levels of inequality and poverty. And what we need are policy positions. What will you do with the power that you get when you're in Westminster? And I think that we aren't getting enough of that, and we certainly didn't get enough of that from that particular interview.
Yeah, those issues kind of traditionally higher up the agenda, perhaps, of the Greens. What did you make of what you heard from Patrick Harvie?
Well, I think Patrick Harvie and the Greens actually almost started their election in advance. The way in which the Butte House agreement ended put them into fight mode, perhaps further in advance than others. So when the general election came, they had a little bit of distance between themselves and the Scottish Government, and I think that helps them now. I think he's right to talk about wealth tax, but what we need is a substantial progressive coalition, a substantial progressive thinking in Westminster to make anything like that actually happen.
OK, Talit, thank you very much indeed. Stay with us as well. Chris Stark, former head of the Climate Change Committee. I asked Patrick Harvie what his offer to voters was this election, and his answer was tax the rich. It wasn't climate, it wasn't the environment. We were talking earlier on about whether that's slipped down the agenda too far. What did you make of what you heard?
Yeah, it's striking, actually, that both of the party leaders didn't talk too much about policy, and I suppose that's inevitable in a general election at UK level, but that's my disappointment. So taxing the rich is one way in which you might raise some of the revenues that we need to make this transition to net zero. Once again, we focused on the issue of oil and gas licenses, and we see, elsewhere on the front pages of various newspapers now, lots of focus on that same issue of oil and gas. And I'm afraid that's not really the issue at all. So, I'm hoping in the future we're going to hear more from our party leaders about what they're going to do about decarbonising homes, making those homes more insulated and energy efficient, what we're going to do about transport systems. Now, Patrick Harvie talked a little bit about that. I had a feeling, actually, he wanted to have more of a platform to talk about that. But, of course, just as Talit says, he is fresh from being ejected from a coalition with the SNP in the Scottish Government, and he sounded like someone who was angry about that. So I would like to see more of that. I'd see more passion about what the future looks like for this economy for Scotland.
Right. Well, manifestos coming out in the next week or two, so perhaps we'll be in a better position to appraise what their priorities are once we've done that. But listen, thank you very much indeed, panel. We'll be back with you in the next 15 minutes or so. Do stay with us. Remember, we are on the television, of course, for a bit longer over the next few weeks. But in about, 17 minutes from now, Fiona's going to be taking over on Radio Scotland with her guests. There they are, sitting tuned through the papers. Morning to you all. David Clegg from the Courier, Shona Craven from the National, Hannah Roger for the Sunday Mail. They are on air with Fiona from 11. Right, let's go back for some insight now with the pollster Mark Diffley, because when the story of this election is finally written, there will surely be a chapter on Reform UK. They split opinion, that's for sure, but in some parts of the country they're polling pretty well and posing a real threat to the Conservatives. Hello again, Mark. Just talk us through Reform polling then. Where are they just now and what's the trend?
Well, if we look at the UK-wide polls, Martin, Reform, I think, probably ever since Nigel Farage at the beginning of this week announced that he was standing, have hit new heights in the polls. So they've been polling up to 17% UK-wide. Interestingly, a couple of polls have been released overnight, have put that back down at sort of 11, 12%, but it's still extraordinarily high. What that doesn't mean is that they'll win a lot of seats, but again, there'll be a big disruptor. The modelling would suggest that Nigel Farage has quite a good chance of winning the seat that he's personally standing in Clacton, but that they won't win any more seats, although if they carry on polling at that level, they may do. In Scotland, they're polling at around 4%, so much less popular here than in other parts of the UK, particularly around the Midlands in southern England.
Right, and look, they're associated in the minds of many, if not most people, with one issue, with the issue of immigration. Just talk to me a bit about Scottish public attitudes, Scottish attitudes on immigration. Are we all Jock Tamson's bairns here? How distinct are we compared to the rest of the UK?
Well, I think we are. I mean, the reality is we are pretty distinct. And we can measure this, I think, in a couple of ways. One is when we ask about what people's key issues are in terms of how they'll vote at the election. Immigration is way down the scale for Scottish voters. It's something like 10th or 11th place. Fewer than 1 in 10 will name immigration as something that's really going to be a driver of how they vote. But if you look at polls down south, that number is about 4 in 10, so about 40% put it in their top 3 issues. And if you drill even further into polls in the UK amongst Conservative voters, it is their number 1 issue. About 2/3 of Conservative voters put it in their top 3 issues. So that's one way in which we can measure the difference. The other is, we published a report recently with Migration Policy Scotland where we looked at the differences in attitudes amongst the public here compared to in England. And it is true that we are more liberal. I mean, about 1/3 of us say that we want immigration to be higher in the UK. That in Scotland, that compares to about 15 or 16% of the public UK-wide who think that. So, and we're very welcoming in terms of people who come to support things like health and social care, or who come on kind of seasonal visas. So, our attitudes are quite different actually to on that issue to the rest of the UK.
Right, OK, listen, that's a really interesting way to frame this next interview. We're going to learn a lot, I think, in the next 10 minutes or so. Mark, thanks very much indeed. Mark Diffley, of course, with us every week right through this campaign. We'll see you next week, Mark. So, thanks. Helen McDade is standing for reform in this election. She's a former vet. She's worked designing policy for environmental charities too. Let's hear what policies she is offering this morning in exchange for our votes. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Martin.
So, I've just given a little bit of one-sentence background on you there. Former vet, policy for the John Muir Trust, I think, in the past.
And WWF.
Yeah, and WWF. Reform, forgive me for making this observation, reform perhaps doesn't strike me as the most obvious home for you politically. Why have you chosen to stand for reform?
OK, I've got here over my lifetime, so I've got a lifetime of experience, and I have observed a number of things. I come from a background, I grew up in Thurso, we had an active industry there, nuclear industry going there, and my father was involved in politics. So both of these things have shaped what I see as well as what I've done. So when I started working with environmental organisations, I had a very neutral view on we aren't talking about climate emergency, and we've changed the rhetoric, it changes. But started asking questions about, well, what about, I was there to protect wild land when I joined the John Muir Trust. What about these wind farms on our best natural landscapes? And the answer I got back then from a very well-known environmentalist is, it's OK, we only need 10% of what's in planning at the moment. And so I've noticed how the rhetoric has changed, and obviously we've heard Patrick this morning. And the thing is, the net zero that we're doing is not working. It is not helping global emissions. We are closing down industry. We're closing down our steel industry. I heard an environmentalist say our emissions have gone down. That's because Ravenscraig shut, but we won't tell anyone that. So people need to know there's a link here that we must have our own economy. And at the moment, we're just going to import those carbon emissions. So that's one of the issues that is of great concern.
Right, an issue that's obviously the kind of central totem perhaps around, I mean, reform's a broad church, but the central totem seems to be the issue of immigration. Some people find your party's policies very difficult on immigration, quite offensive, some people would say. Are they right?
I would say be careful what you say. We have candidates who worry about their safety because of the portrayal about us. And all I can say is we are a broad church and we are saying there is too much immigration, and it has nothing to do with race. It is to do with people coming in who we have not said we have skills in this. So we have policies on this. We will let people working in the health and social care come in. Without that will not be stopped by a zero net immigration. So when we need people, we can take people in. At the moment, we are taking lots of people in. 1.5 million over 2 years have come into the country. Where is their housing? Where is their healthcare? When people worry about the top issues, these things are affected.
For net zero, though, you need people to leave as well, obviously. So if you're bringing in a lot of people to work in health and social care, who are you getting rid of and how?
No, they're excluded from the net zero.
Right.
So if we needed a lot of, we would train up our own, and one of the things we would do on that is that when doctors and nurses qualify, we would give them a tax break for 3 years.
Hospitality?
Can I just stop on doctors and nurses, because we were talking about healthcare? So we would give them a tax break for 3 years, and we'd also take off their tuition fees. They'd be given 10% a year off. So if they stayed 10 years in the NHS, their tuition fees would be put away.
Which other sectors get a pass on this one then? Hospitality? It's suffering massively as a result of Brexit.
Well, for a start off, if you look at other countries, and I spoke to an Irish lady recently, if you look at France, these countries are also suffering from worker shortage. A lot of that was to do with COVID, which came in at the same time as Brexit, the COVID lockdown. A lot of people went home to their countries, to their families, and haven't come back.
So the answer is not cutting immigration?
The answer to our other problems, what we've just said, where are the healthcare, where are the social care, and where is the housing for the people who've come in? You know, twice the population of Manchester have come in the last years.
How do you fill these jobs?
Which jobs?
Hospitality, for example, the sector we were just discussing.
We want a high-wage, high-trained economy, and that's what we need to start. We need to encourage people back into work. And we've got
so you're going to see businesses close down across the board, aren't you?
No, we have got a policy for this as well.
Well, if you tell people to put their wages up, a lot of people won't be able to afford to do it, and bang goes the business.
Smaller businesses are getting an exemption on the workers' tax for our immigration, but also we would give people under 20,000, people who are earning under 20,000 would not pay basic income tax. That would get a lot of people out of poverty.
How are you going to pay for that?
Well, we're going to abolish net zero, which will get us 30 billion, and we will also...
How does abolishing net zero get you 30 million? Where's the sums
30
on
billion.
That? 30 billion, sorry,
30
of course.
billion.
Where's the sums on that?
Well, we are paying at the moment huge amounts of money to renewable energy companies. There's a lot of talk about the windfall tax on the oil and gas companies. Nobody talked about doing it on the renewables company, which did very well over COVID. So they are getting a lot of money in subsidies. You probably know.
So you're killing our green industry?
Well, you probably are aware that wind farms that don't produce, because we don't have the grid for it, get paid more than the days that they produce. Nobody thinks that's sensible economics, and we would stop that. It would cost a lot of money to build the transmission grid that's needed. And these companies are gaming the system. They're putting wind farms in areas.
You're also cutting public spending by 5% to pay for this new tax system. How many jobs is that going to cost?
Well, we would cut backroom jobs and get frontroom jobs. But the truth of the matter is...
Hang on, overall, you're cutting public spending by 5%. How many jobs does that cost? That must have been factored in. Have you got a figure?
I don't have the figure, but the figures are costed. I'm sure you've seen our contract.
You're standing for public office. Where's the figure?
It's in my contract, but I do know that it is costed, unlike some of the other people you've interviewed this morning.
You just don't know the cost?
OK, I don't know that particular cost because I am not the economist expert. Do please invite him on. I'm sure he'd be pleased to come and answer that question.
Here's the problem, Helen McDade. Your party's not like most political parties. It's not really a political party. It's a private vehicle for Nigel Farage. He gets to make up policy on the hoof. He doesn't have to put it through a committee. We saw it the other night in the BBC debate where he, seemingly off his heels, said, all right, we'll have a European-style health system. We'll do what the French do.
That is not off this cuff. That is exactly what our policy is.
OK. So at what point do people start paying for their health care?
We would have a combination of insurance for those who can afford it and also tax breaks.
Where's the bar?
And we would... There's no bar.
It would be free.
It would be free at the point of use, the same as it is in France, the same as it is in many other countries.
The same as it is in Britain just now. So how's that reform?
It's reform of the NHS. I mean...
He said it was a French-style system. What you're proposing now is the system we've got at the moment. Free at the point of use for everybody, private if you want to pay for it.
No, because we would use private where if people could not get an appointment within a certain time, they would be given a voucher to go and get private treatment elsewhere.
How much is that going to cost?
It will be cheaper than the NHS.
You want your hip done, that's 20 grand. You get a voucher for 20 grand.
People are already paying for it. We all know this. People
they're
who
paying
can't
for
afford
it, not the state.
The state is paying for it. I believe 850 million was the report in the paper this morning that the SNP have paid for private healthcare.
So my understanding from an interview I heard with one of your colleagues in Manchester was that there will be, once you earn over a certain level, you have to get private health insurance. Is that not the policy? There seems to be a bit of confusion over it.
I think that is how it works in France. That's my understanding.
That is how it works in France. So that is the policy here.
So people would have to pay in the same way as they pay in at the moment to national health and national insurance and...
OK.
Yeah.
Still want to scrap Holyrood?
That's not our policy and hasn't been our policy.
Right.
We are looking at constitutional reform. We want change. We want change on constitutional level. We want change of our healthcare system, and we want change in the civil service. And to come back to Holyrood, it does need looking at. I'm sure you're aware that the system at the moment, the unicameral system, where there isn't a revising chamber, has led to some very difficult things. And you can watch committees doing a good job and then it just gets put out the way. And planning is an example of that, where a cross-party group did a very good job in the committee and it made not a lot of difference to the planning that we have. OK,
Helen McDade, thank you very much indeed. Reform have certainly blasted into this campaign in the past week. We'll see what happens in the, just less than a month we've got left. Thank you very much for coming in to be with us this Sunday morning. Right, lots of politics this morning. Full list of candidates standing for your vote is available on the BBC News website. Let's get some final thoughts, shall we, from our panel. Chris Stark, I'm going to come to you first. Preserve peatlands, no wind turbines. The message there from Helen McDade, or one of the messages from Helen McDade. What do you make of that?
Well, that was one of the messages, but there's a lot of incoherence in the other messages. So scrapping a net zero target and apparently saving £30 billion, I don't recognise any of those numbers. So very disappointing to hear some of that. And I suppose what that tells me is that Reform UK really doesn't have a clear policy on this, unlike all the other parties. So I very much heard that today. A very confused set of messages, I thought.
All right, Talat Yaqub, what do you make of it?
Well, I think it almost is irrelevant who's in front of you when it's Nigel Farage that's leading the charge in all of this. He's a majority stakeholder in a company that is running in this election. And I think particularly the rhetoric, the divisive rhetoric around immigration is really harmful and uncalled for across all candidates and all positions of the Reform Party. In the debate earlier this week, Nigel Farage attempted to call this the immigration election. And I think it's important to remember the audience didn't respond well to that. In fact, the only time they applauded was when that was called out. The division and rhetoric that is harmful to immigrants was called out. That's when it got the most applause. So I think there needs to be some significant scepticism around the rhetoric used by Reform and just how much platform they are being given.
Well, yeah, but look, he is we've heard from the polling, they're in danger of overtaking the Conservatives, in danger from a Conservative point of view. And he is a persuasive politician. You're somebody who devotes their professional life to campaigning for equality. Are you worried about what they might do in this election?
Well, what I'm more worried about is that their position is adopted by the larger parties. So Nigel Farage, once of UKIP, has already been successful in pulling politics to the right. That's what got us to the disaster of Brexit in the first place. My concern is his influence over the rest of politics and how he moves the centre ground to the right. I think he has undue influence across politics. I think our politics can do better, and I think we shouldn't take the lowest common denominator and the low bar that Nigel Farage and his company in this election sets for us.
OK, Dougal Sharp, let me come to you finally. You do projections, presumably into the future. You've said to us a couple of times this morning you're not very certain. We're on a bit shaky ground politically just now. How do you plan for the future? How optimistic, pessimistic are you in your planning?
Well, to do what I do, you've got to be optimistic. Leading a small company in Scotland, it's the only way. But I think there was just a couple of points that struck out. For me, net zero is clearly a defining issue of our times. And I'd like to see more investment in sort of taking that leadership. We've got a leadership position in the development of a fusion power generation. That is a way to completely decarbonise our economy, and we should be focusing more on that. We should be investing more on that, because that is one way that we can just reliably produce electricity and power that we need in our economy.
Dougal, I'm going to have to cut you off there because we are bang out of time. We're about to crash off the air. Let me thank you and Chris Stark and Talat Yaqub, our panel this morning, and let me thank you all for being with us on the Sunday show. That is it from me for this morning. I'm going to be back next week, same time, same place, for an hour. We're going to have a sit down with the Labour leader, Anas Sarwar. He's our guest next week. For now, though, it is over to Fiona for more of all of this on the radio and BBC Sounds. From me, enjoy your week. Goodbye.